for society to provide freedom. I asked you those questions on Monday. And then I added another question, which is what barriers exist that get in the way of that freedom. Because you've already written about this, you don't need to write about it, but don't burn me on this. I'm trusting you to be prepared to participate verbally. So make sure your group has some stuff to say about all this.
What was that? Freedom is not having struck well.
Does that mean I have to speak?
Yeah.
That second. We're done with the semester. God. I'm taking one class. Alright, so
Or want the pink one?
she said fine.
Interpreting him as asking for this question is, what is the, and he added a third question for it, you know, what would get in the way of freedom? So, and I put,
To me.
as the interpreter of that question,
What did you put? Oh, on third? I didn't answer that.
It's from last time. Oh, the full one? Yeah. You have to like let him know that's what we want.
Okay, so what do you guys think?
I don't even know. Oh.
Yeah, so choice of how you would do
I'll
it.
get rid of the police.
And then having like equal opportunity.
I didn't put they need some barriers, yeah.
I just read question
What
one.
did you say?
I said the freedom and choice of how you live your life and equal opportunity for success.
Is that what you got?
I put the same thing,
Yeah, that's pretty much what I put. How about, for who, definition of freedom did y'all agree on? Franklin or Ronald? Okay, let's do that. Oh, I chose Franklin.
Wait, what?
For like, who y'all definitely definition.
The first one, I forgot which one was it.
Franklin?
Yeah.
Why?
I keep scratching stuff out. That I can never
So pretty much we agreed on the choice to live your life and equal opportunities for success.
Yeah.
Okay.
100%. What do you guys think you're gonna get in class?
I better
I gotta be. Maybe.
because right now, like,
Just a little.
I think it'd be, yeah, there's a great calculator.
like what you have by the overall point that it's already
Oh,
given.
so like the points you have, divide that by the, and that's what you bring.
They should be able to expand the
76.
idea.
I don't know if I want to, it's about that.
Yeah.
I mean, we have this exam, the field next week. Yeah, next week. So I'm gonna do that too. I should be able to.
It's on Friday, I think. This Friday. I think it's watch your video and what else?
like maybe in a different country, there aren't as many guns.
How much extra credit do you get?
I think if we're done.
Yeah. Dude, yeah, I would do that.
I know he said it was gonna be less than the other one, but into that.
He gave me a 10 for that one.
I forgot to do that.
He put it in?
Oh, I did that too.
How much is the extra credit on Friday? How much is the extra credit that we're supposed to do on Friday? 5 points. 5 points.
So half.
Which could be great.
It could. I need it.
But you're not taking the final?
No, I am. I'm actually gonna have to take it earlier to get this on Friday. Me either, that's why we're going to try that.
Social classes.
Right.
Life. Life in general.
Barriers,
Yeah.
corporations, or like,
Monopoly.
yeah, monopolies. So like,
Me, that's the 1%.
For
not always, but
Hey, I'll take some of that.
yeah.
Yeah, I'll take it.
I'm not.
And one.
Because I gotta work.
Yeah, this semester was
Oh my
It's
god.
only gonna get harder.
Yeah, I know. I'm already at 50 credits.
Like, whenever I get into my degree,
Yeah, she was so scared.
I don't think I'm gonna get my associate.
I'm not.
I think I've been like searching into it because a lot of people are like, why don't you just wait to transfer to your like 6 associates? But I'm like, do I have to? I really don't have to. It doesn't matter. I can still, transfer.
What do you want to do?
I'm a business major. I want to go to Dallas School of Business.
Okay.
Yeah, this transfer. I would. I mean, really,
No,
You
you
know,
can't really use it.
associates.
It doesn't
really-
really
it doesn't-
separate you.
The only time I think an associate's really works is if it's like that's all that job needs.
Yeah.
Or like a company since you can get an associate.
Yeah, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna take some summer classes here. I'm just gonna take 2 now. I'm taking government and forgot the other one. But yeah.
Taking Chem, and I have to take my calculus class next semester.
Oh my god. Oh, I'm taking government and accounting.
So you're originally from California?
San Diego.
You come all the way here for school, or no?
Well, my dad was a Marine. Then whenever he retired, I told y'all he makes video games, right? So Midway closed down, and then another job offered him work in Austin. So we relocated to Austin. I went to school, high school out there. But the company he works for now, I don't know. But something whenever we moved out to Austin. But that was years ago. I'm sure he didn't work. He switched like 3 jobs.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was thinking about taking summer classes, but I'm just gonna be working the whole time. I'm gonna get into cryptocurrency stuff. So that's why
Are you gonna mine?
I could mine.
It's dangerous.
But,
Be careful. I just took environmental science.
Yeah. So I'm doing cryptocurrency. And I'm also doing forex. So I'm trying to do all that so I can just make money online, and I can just go to school and make money online.
He invests in Bitcoin.
Dude, you should just save up some money and like build a mining rig and then just be
Yeah.
That's what I
How
would
much
do.
is a mining rig? Like 5K?
5K.
It depends. It depends
I feel like
on
it'd be
How many graphics cards do you need?
like probably I would say for you probably like three and you want to get like good
You ready?
ones.
Yeah.
You probably spend like at least 3
Okay, I'll show you guys the results. Pretty different from my last class, which is interesting. That kind of happens a lot. But who do you think is going to win your presidential election?
Bernie Sanders.
You think so? You're right. Although in general, this was the most Republican class I've ever had. In that Trump got 4 votes, Cruz got 3 votes, Kasich got 1 vote. Cruz and Kasich combined got 0 in my morning class. So this is kind of interesting. I mean, it's way less pronounced. In my morning class, Sanders got 12 votes, I think, and Clinton got 6, something like that. And then this was not as surprising. Zinn won pretty overwhelmingly. So one thing I was kind of looking for, and I was kind of thinking about the Roosevelt-Reagan stuff from Monday as well, is I think, you know, you guys are young yet, you're sort of working through kind of your viewpoint on stuff. But I definitely noticed some internal inconsistencies. So for example, if you were convinced by Howard Zinn what would vote for Ted Cruz or something like that, I would say there's a contradiction there in that I would say a guy like Ted Cruz represents everything Bernie Sanders opposes and that Howard Zinn opposes. So again, you don't have to be consistent, right? It's a complicated world. There's lots of reasons to vote for someone other than things like economic policy or whatever. So I'm not going to ask too many specific questions about this, just because I don't want people to have to sort of defend their own personal political beliefs. Anything up here either surprising or not surprising to people?
Surprised there's so much Trump.
There were two Trump people I think in my morning class. And I think something I'll probably come back to at the very end of class today is I think this is sort of interesting in that, you know, what I was trying to set up on Monday is basically Roosevelt pretty much still represents the kind of core message of the Democratic Party. We'll talk about the idea of freedom in a minute. Reagan still represents the kind of core beliefs of the Republican Party. And yet, Democrat voters among you chose Sanders, who's a pretty far left by the standards of the mainstream Democratic Party, and Donald Trump, who's a whole other animal than any other Republican, really. Talk about not really being consistent. Whereas, you know, an orthodox Republican would be somewhere in the Kasich to Cruz spectrum, and an orthodox Democrat's probably closer to Hillary Clinton. So we kind of keep this stuff in mind as we talk, but I would say it's consistent with what I've seen before, though, like I said, you guys have more Republican voters than I normally have in your class, which is fun. So let's talk about these questions I had you guys answer. Now we can spend an entire philosophy class, I assume, talking about what freedom is. We'll try to answer it in like 10 seconds. What's freedom? Who can tell me? Yeah.
The right to do whatever you want.
The right to do whatever you want. Oops, I spelled the second letter I got wrong. What does that mean, do whatever you want?
Be able to do anything without harming other
Okay,
people.
so that's a little different, right? What do you mean by do everything you want?
We actually meant that you can do whatever you want with that.
Murder, burglary?
Yeah, basic freedom would be that. No, we're not saying it's okay.
That
We're
is-
saying
But
that
Okay.
that's what
freedom.
freedom is, do whatever you
So
want.
that's what freedom is, do whatever you want. Okay, that's a fair definition. You guys say it's something closer to do what you want if it doesn't harm others, is that what you said, something like that?
Yeah, we also said equal opportunity for success.
Okay, I think that's a separate point. And in some ways a contradictory one, I would say, but that's a good one. So we got do whatever the hell you want, we got do whatever the hell you want within limits. Other ideas? You guys told me you were ready. Don't make me regret it. Of which one? Same as what?
It's part of the list.
Okay. Okay. Okay, good. So, anything else we need to add to this? Yeah.
Be yourself without being judged.
Okay. So all of these, I think, potentially can limit anything that we have a positive freedom to do can limit someone else's freedom, right? So if I want to, I don't know, steal my neighbor's stuff, that limits his right to his ability to have that stuff, right? If I murder my neighbor, that certainly limits his equal opportunity to pursue happiness or whatever. If I have the freedom to ridicule or fire my coworker because they believe something different than me, that limits their ability to be themselves. So all this stuff is tangled, and that's what it's supposed to be, which is good. So let's add on to this. Okay, so this is what freedom is. How does a society provide this stuff? What do we need to make this stuff actually real instead of just some kind of abstraction?
Law.
What kind of laws?
Freedom of speech.
I like that. Okay, freedom of speech is good. Why is that important? Okay. Yeah, I mean, okay, that's a good answer. What are the laws that provide freedom for people? First Amendment in general, I think that's good. You guys talked about this. Did you put some laws in place, or can we still do whatever we want?
Yeah, I mean, we said that, kind of what you were saying a second ago, that, you know, if you give everybody rights, you give a serial killer the right to kill, he's taking away someone else's right to live. So SB law is where if you're giving one person rights, it can't take away someone else's rights.
Okay. So, yeah, so I think your first questions, your answer sort of abstractly gets to, I mean, certainly some combination of do what you want, but don't really affect other people's ability to do what they want is a pretty clear answer to this question, although obviously on the ground it's super complicated. What about this one? You say equal opportunity. How is that provided by a society or for a society? Still laws or something else?
You probably have anti-discrimination laws.
Okay. What else can a society do to try to provide equal opportunity for people?
Option for school.
Okay, education.
Loans,
What do you mean?
loans, like being able to provide for, you know, being able to provide for your family is equal opportunity as those who can.
Okay, like you mean like student loans or home loans, all that stuff?
Yeah, and
Okay.
all loans.
Sure. Yeah, a lot of things that are important in life, we don't have the cash to buy offhand, right? What else?
More jobs.
Okay. How do we make sure people have jobs?
Businesses.
Well, we have
Like,
businesses.
we want, like, the things that we want, we're able to make it, like, in-house. So like, if you have a company and you're outsourcing it, you're not giving equal opportunities to your people. But if you have, like, you know, a business and you use people here, then you just opened up, you know, 10,000 more jobs for everyone in, you know, your area, your community, your society.
Okay, so how is that enforced?
Oh.
How do you make sure that company doesn't send those jobs someplace else?
Increase taxes on, you know, shipping, or like, you know.
Okay, so tariffs is a way to do that.
Tariffs,
You could also do lower corporate tax rate.
You talk about the corporate tax rates. So to me, that's a really good example of where the sort of, you can say Reagan and Roosevelt, you can say left and right, you can say Democrat and Republican, whatever, ideas about something like that create really obvious conflicts here, right? So let's say the government requires or heavily encourages or whatever jobs to stay here. Whose liberty is being violated at this time? Yeah, so someone like Ronald Reagan would say all those regulations to keep those jobs here infringe upon that business's ability to do things like ship its jobs abroad or park its income in another country where there's lower taxes or that sort of thing. So again, go back to Monday, it kind of comes back to this question of where the problem lies and how you fix it, right? If someone like Roosevelt would say we should put a system in place, either through laws or programs or whatever, to try to prevent jobs from going abroad. Whereas a guy like Reagan would say yes, but that would infringe upon that company's right to do what it wants with its money and its resources. And so that's a pretty fundamental divide, I would say. Other ideas how we can ensure equal opportunity for people? Is this happening now? I heard a somewhat and a kinda. I think those are good answers. Why kinda and not yes? Or why kinda and not no?
We're trying as a society, but we're not there yet.
Okay. So what are we not doing that we could do?
Equal pay,
Okay, what do you mean, for everyone?
for like men and women.
Okay, how is that gonna be enforced?
Raising women's salaries,
Who's gonna make the employer do that?
government.
Okay, so that's what I'm trying to tease out here, right? A lot of these things end up being a standoff between government regulation on one side, which is kind of the necessary limit on a lot of these things you guys are talking about, versus the private sector on the other side, which isn't going to want to do these things, right? They're not going to want to pay an American worker when they can pay someone somewhere else whose labor costs less than 1/10 what it costs here. Same thing with things like general income inequality or whatever. What else could be done that isn't being done if you guys think there should be more? Maybe you think there should be less also. What should we do? You guys don't know how to create an equal society within the next 10 minutes or so?
I mean, I don't think it should necessarily be equal. But
Okay, that's an answer too.
yeah, like, I mean, obviously if it's equal, then there's no point in trying to succeed and stuff. But there should be a little less of a difference maybe. I think definitely there should be a higher minimum wage, at least not an hour.
Okay, and even that also is going to be a battleground, right? Where one group can say, what we should try to make sure, I mean, again, if you go back to the kind of basic Roosevelt versus Reagan thing, a guy like Roosevelt would say, we should try to create a floor that no one has to fall beneath, whether that's through jobs programs or minimum wages or that sort of thing. All of that is government regulation. But then the people in the private sector on the Reagan side will say, yeah, but now you're taking away my right to pay a worker whatever to work for, or you're taking away my right to operate my business as I see fit. So, again, if you think about, if you're going to take this back to our sort of modern political debate, which side of the spectrum is Bernie Sanders on? How would he solve these problems?
Pile on the regulations.
Yeah, so Bernie Sanders is way more in the Roosevelt mold of, again, that's why I think there's a lot of inconsistencies in some of the responses I got here for all these various questions I've been asking, in that Sanders is sort of an exaggerated version of Roosevelt, in that he sees a public kind of government role in many, many things where there isn't really one today, right? If you think about, he would look for government-provided health insurance and health coverage. That's not currently the case. Many more regulations on big business in order to try to limit inequality and that sort of thing. Certainly a higher minimum wage, higher taxes on the wealthy, all sorts of stuff that we saw as part of the kind of Roosevelt generation of Democrats, but is not particularly pushed that hard by kind of Clinton, more mainstream Democrats today. What about be yourself? How the hell do we enforce that?
It's kind of the same as the first one.
Freedom of speech and stuff?
Yeah.
Okay. Other ideas? That's an arrow. That's not a very good arrow.
I was like,
Looking at a weird X.
No discrimination.
Okay. We got that too. So again, so that comes down to laws as well. So I hope what I'm trying to do here is becoming kind of clear, where ultimately all of these things you run into a conflict, which is this conflict between kind of the private sector, which is businesses and that sort of thing, or lack of regulation in various aspects of our lives, versus the recognition that if we want to do things like equal the playing field, provide educations, these sort of things, they require expanded government. And all of those things are, that's kind of the essence of this entire class, in that, I mean this whole course, not just today's class, where that's kind of always a battleground. Every single thing we think about had that battle sort of orbiting around it. You can think about something in my last class, for example, something like civil rights, where I think today most people look back pretty favorably on the civil rights movement and its achievements. But of course, at the time, it was heavily, heavily resisted, right? You guys read the Montgomery Bus Boycott book. We talked about that during Units 3 and Unit 4. And someone in my last class brought up this question. Again, it's kind of a massive can of worms for us to get into. But let's say you have an anti-discrimination law. Even that limits someone's freedom. Whose freedom is violated there? Racist people, right? So one question becomes, how much should we value the opinions of racists, or the freedoms of people to be racist and discriminatory? I think that's right. So so obviously the United States has decided, for the most part, we don't have to really protect the freedom of people to discriminate openly. Yeah.
That goes back to the point of, do we give a serial killer the right to kill?
Right.
Can we give one person rights if it takes away someone else's rights?
Yeah, and the point I want to get at today is that these things have been kind of battlegrounds. Now, I think in the case of civil rights, rightfully we've decided as a society, we don't need to protect people's right to discriminate in businesses and that sort of thing. Like the example that came out in my Monday class or in my morning class, which some of you are probably familiar with, is you guys know what the kind of cake baking lawsuit related to gay marriage?
No.
How many of you know what I'm talking about?
Cake baking.
A couple of you. Can somebody give us the thumbnail sketch of it?
That they did, one Christian company didn't want to make a cake for a gay couple for their marriage or something like that.
Right, and so basically, yeah, a gay couple came to have a cake made for their wedding. The people said we disagree with homosexuality in general due to our religious beliefs. We're not going to make your cake, and it's opened up this massive can of worms because obviously that's the exact same thing that segregationists would have said in the 60s, right? We don't want to serve a black person because we don't agree with them or whatever. We are discriminatory against them. We have the right to be discriminatory. Where that situation stands now is that you don't have the right to discriminate against someone for who they are. So in the case of like the cake thing, defenders of the company would say, well, if they have to make that cake, then some other cake maker will have to make a cake with a swastika on it or something about ISIS or whatever. But that's not the case. The way this works is you can't deny someone's service based on something that you do as part of your business. So if you make cakes that say, congratulations on your wedding, and someone comes in and says, I want one of those, you can't say, I'm not going to give you one because of who you are. However, if they ask you to do something you don't normally do, like make a cake with a swastika on it, you can deny someone's service. So we've been working this stuff out as a sort of a country and a legal system for decades. And what we've come to is certainly some groups' rights, especially the right of discriminators and racists, don't get as much focus or as much respect as those who've been fighting for their equality during this entire course. But again, I just bring up that example to show that these same sorts of battles, which we in some ways settled, right? I mean, again, I hope that at the end of this class, students are sympathetic with things like the civil rights movement, even if it took away the rights of racists. But that sort of battle is still kind of going through other iterations today. And again, it's beyond my ability to predict the future. But my hope is that by the end of this course, we can sort of think about the stuff we see in society or politics or economics or whatever. All of these things are the results of historical battles. And that's kind of why I do the Zinn and Johnson thing from the beginning, to sort of think about how competing ideas about what America is, who America's for, these things have been butting up against each other since the beginning of the nation. And we're just sort of in one playing out of that in a lot of respects today. But anyway, there's too many thoughts for me to sort of sort through in a coherent way when I do this. But I do think over time, I think a lot of you will find that your views become more coherent in terms of, to me, so for example, like Sanders support and Zinn and Roosevelt all kind of go together on one side in terms of trying to protect common people and government intervention, that sort of thing. And then I think certainly Johnson and like someone like Ted Cruz or John Kasich go together pretty clearly in terms of kind of orthodox conservative viewpoints about small government and that kind of thing. I don't know where the hell Trump fits because he doesn't really have very coherent viewpoints, although of course he's more closer to Republican viewpoints in general than Democrat ones. I don't know, I think I've rambled enough. So let me do a little time check here. Okay, so what I want to do in the time we've got left is we're gonna do some other stuff kind of related to this stuff on Friday as well. But I want to show you not the rest of the whole movement, the rest of what I'm going to show you from that 13th documentary. So we left that story off at the end of the Reagan era, when we saw this massive surge in the prison population. What we'll see today is kind of how that continues into the Bush and Clinton eras, and ultimately into your own lifetimes. As I mentioned last time we watched this, I highly recommend you kind of treat this as lecture, take notes and all that, because a lot of this might be very helpful in writing your exam lesson.
Because I'm not just saying that white people believe this, right? Black people also believe this and are terrified of our own selves.
Do you want to go back to the days of military weakness, caring more about criminals than victims? We can't risk that. I'd like your vote on Tuesday.
Leadership that's on your side. Michael Dukakis for president.
In the midst of the presidential campaign, an ad was released about a person by the name of Willie Horton.
Bush and Dukakis on crime. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton.
This became a focal point of an entire presidential campaign.
Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
Dukakis had protected the program, vetoed an effort to repeal it, and that he favored letting murderers out on the weekend.
That Dukakis had a double-digit lead over Bush before the campaign focused on Willie Horton, and after that, Bush overtook Dukakis and won the election.
Which candidate for president can you really count on to be tough on crime? George Bush.
Bush won the election by creating fear around black men as criminal without saying that's what he was doing.
A very racially, divisive moment, depicting an African American criminal, I think, was deliberate on the part of that campaign. There's no one who can tell me otherwise.
Liberals calling Willie Horton to make it sound like you're being dismissive. Original article was Reader's Digest. William Horton, no picture. The Democrats, the ones you know he's black.
Thanks, Grover. It was not his name, it was his image that was sensationalized.
Liberals that announced that it was mean to pick on a murderer and a rapist lose all credibility on this discussion. They just lose it. And people go, we don't want to hear anything else you have to say about crime.
No matter what anybody says, what anybody does, they know exactly what button they were trying to hit with that ad. Stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend.
It went to a kind of primitive fear, a primitive American fear, because Willie Horton was metaphorically the black male rapist that had been a staple of the white imagination since the time just after slavery.
Here was a black man convicted of rape. I would be the savior and protector of the white population, never minding the fact that the history of interracial rape in this country, that record is far more marked by white rape against black women than of black men against white women.
This idea that had such great artistic utility in 1915 in Birth of a Nation still had a great deal of political utility almost at the end of that century.
The way that we appeal to voters' sense of fear and anxiety in our nation runs through black bodies.
They're a new generation of Democrats, Bill Clinton and Al Gore, and they don't think the way the old Democratic Party did. They've sent a strong signal to criminals by supporting the death penalty.
Looking at the way in which Democrats were defeated in 1988, that they were defeated in 1984, that they were defeated in 1980, there comes to be a sentiment among the Democrats that they have to adopt a position that is much more kind of centrist.
It became virtually impossible for a politician to run and appear soft on crime.
I was not for the bill that he was talking about because it was not tough enough on the criminal.
You know, when you're in an environment where everybody's trying to do the same thing, everybody's competing to be tough on crime, you quickly all end up in the same space, so it doesn't become a political advantage unless you do something more.
We need more police on the street. There is a crime bill which would put more police on the street, which was killed for this session by a filibuster in the Senate, mostly by Republican senators.
We'd consistently had squishy, soft, liberal won't protect you, tough conservative will protect you. We won that fight every time. And by the late 80s, early 90s, people like Bill Clinton had begun to figure out they had to be able to match us.
I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Bill Clinton is trying to figure out how he can deal with a country that's still basically Reagan's country, but he's trying to govern as a Democrat.
Violent crime and the fear it provokes are crippling our society.
Then some high-profile, very horrendous crimes take place.
Residents pulled together in the search for 12-year-old Polly Klaas. They're now coping with the discovery of her body over the weekend.
Polly Klaas abducted from her bedroom at home and ultimately killed, which led to the California 3 strikes and you're outlaw.
When you commit a third violent crime, you will be put away and put away for good. 3 strikes and you are out.
A person is convicted of their third felony, essentially that person is mandated to prison for the rest of their lives.
So many third strike defendants awaiting trial, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department is forced to release 4,200 misdemeanor inmates every month to make room for incoming 3-strike prisoners.
And it's in line with many of the other policies we've created, particularly mandatory minimums.
Mandatory sentencing. We said we were no longer going to let judges consider the circumstances around a crime. We're just going to impose a mandatory sentence.
And that's a difficult thing for judges because they are trying to dispense justice on a daily basis and are unable to do so.
In many California communities, all civil trials have been canceled to catch up with the criminal case workload.
We've taken discretion away from judges, arguably the most neutral party in the court, and given it over to prosecutors.
95% of the elected prosecutors throughout the United States are white.
Serious violent criminals serve at least 85% of their sentence.
We passed a truth in sentencing law that kept people in prison for 85% of their sentence.
Truth in sentencing. The idea is you're sentenced to a certain amount of time. The public wants to be confident that you're going to do just about every bit of that time.
We've done away with parole. So when you get, in the federal system, when you get 20 years or 30 years, that's what you got.
We had parole in this country as a mechanism for getting people out of jails and prisons when it was clear that they were no longer a threat to public safety.
Sharonda has spent the last 16 years in prison, and she'll die there because she was sentenced to life without parole. Her only crime, transporting cocaine. And when I say only crime, I mean only crime. She had no other arrests, none. The judge was required to send Sharonda away for life.
Longer sentences, 3 strikes and you're out. Almost 60 new capital punishment offenses.
And then comes to Congress with a proposal for a $30 billion federal crime bill of 1994 that was heavily loaded towards law enforcement incarceration.
I propose a 21st century crime bill to deploy the latest technologies and tactics to make our communities even safer.
That omnibus crime bill was responsible for a massive expansion of the prison system. And beyond that, it provided all kinds of money and perverse incentives for law enforcement to do a lot of the things that we nowadays consider to be abusive.
It will be used to build prisons to keep 100,000 violent criminals off the street.
Not only does he increase funding to states to build prisons, to lock up as many people involved in drug crimes, but also to put 100,000 police officers on the street.
Crime has been a hot political issue, used too often to divide us.
What President Clinton did in 1994 was actually far more harmful than his predecessors because he actually built that infrastructure that we see today, the militarization, all the way down to small rural police departments that have SWAT teams.
And again, we see this kind of notching up the number of people who are being arrested at every level and this kind of exploding prison population.
We are a nation that professes freedom, yet we have this mass incarceration, this hyper incarceration that is trawling into it, grinding into it, our most vulnerable citizenry, and is overwhelmingly biased towards people of color.
I want to say a few words about it. Because I signed a bill that made the problem worse. And I want to admit it.
His 1994 crime bill, something that he now admits was a mistake.
There were longer sentences. And most of these people are in prison under state law, but the federal law set a trend. And that was overdone. We were wrong about that.
Well, I think it's important that President Clinton acknowledges that things didn't turn out exactly as he and all of us would have wished.
I'm happy that he realizes the error of his ways. I think he knew back then that it wasn't good policy, I'll be honest.
Back then, there was an outcry over the rising crime rate, and people from all communities were asking that action be taken. Now, my husband said at the NAACP last summer that it solved some problems, but it created other problems, and I agree.
I'm glad to see that he is apologetic, but I think he has to take responsibility and accountability for that, and so does Hillary, because she supported it, then and up until recently.
Bill Clinton faced off against a group of Black Lives Matter protesters protesting a 1994 crime bill that they say led to a surge in the imprisonment of black people.
I don't know how you would characterize the gang leaders who got 13-year-old kids hopped up on crack and sent them out onto the street to murder other African-American children. Maybe you thought they were good citizens. She didn't. She didn't. You are defending the people who kill the lives you say matter. Tell the truth.
We can't ignore the reality of force here. The policies that Bill Clinton put forward, mandatory minimums, 3 strikes, those were a use of political force. They forced millions of people who would not otherwise be in prison today into prison. They forced families to be broken. They forced children to live without their parents. That's what happened.
Why?
So we've talked about, so many issues, obviously, hyper-polarized Republicans and Democrats, left-wing, right-wing, whatever. This issue we see both parties basically pursuing the same policy. Why do you think that is? Why do you think Clinton, if you think about Clinton and say Reagan, right? We got a Democrat on one side, we got a Republican on the other. And they're basically pursuing the exact same policy. Why do you think?
Pandering for votes.
Okay, yeah, what do you mean by that?
Like those new teachers were saying, that this idea that all the liberals were soft on crime, so they had to make themselves appear to be tough on crime so that they would get voted.
Yeah, to me, I think there's a parallel here with what we saw in the 50s with anti-communism, right? Where Republicans take a harder line on anti-communism. You can think about a guy like McCarthy as an exaggerated example of that. That puts the Democrats on the defensive, where we can't look soft on communism, so we're going to go hard anti-communism as well. And what that ends up doing is kind of narrowing the width of the kind of political debate, right? Everyone just agrees, anti-communism is the policy of American public life. And I think something similar with crime, where one side kind of recognizes we're losing because we look soft on crime, we're going to get hard on crime as well, and then that kind of narrows the bands of options. And I think in some ways we can bring this back to where we started today. I think part of that idea is why your top 2 vote getters for your class, and again, even more so other classes I've had, are both kind of not part of that traditional scheme, right? And certainly Sanders is not a real traditional Democrat. Trump's certainly not a very traditional Republican. I think part of that is, I think one of the things you saw in 2016 is this sort of expression of frustration that the system as it exists doesn't offer a lot of people what they think they want. And you can also think about cheerful robots. We looked at that article a couple weeks ago, Stuart Mills, where he says, we get to choose between candidates, but we don't necessarily feel all that good about either one. We don't necessarily feel like we're generating the choices we're choosing from. And I think one of the things we saw in 2016, which I think it'll be a turning point election, for people like me who teach this stuff and future generations of American history teachers, it'll be a real turning point election, I think, because I think in one level is a rejection of a lot of the kind of the way in which 2-party politics has worked for a really long time, and people are looking for other answers. And of course, they're looking in vastly different places if you think about Donald Trump versus Bernie Sanders. But I think it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next couple of years as well, where this expression of frustration of kind of, these are my options, these are the policies we seem to pursue. I think they're kind of, through people who are coming of age when you guys are, right? Sort of first-time voters for some of you guys maybe in 2016 or if not 2018 or 2020, where I think the system as it's existed, which is, in the scheme of things, in a pretty narrow band of options, I think people are looking for other ideas, and I think part of that's a result of just sort of looking at what's out there and feeling like something's maybe missing. But I don't know, it's too hard to tell from a historian's perspective what the hell's going on, but you'll figure it out over the next 50 years. All right, we're out of time for today, so I know we didn't do a journal entry, but go ahead and throw your journals in the box. I got a couple old entries to take a closer look at.